Sometimes, when you're working on an Amiga, you get just enough signs of life to know there's something there, but not enough information to really make any decisions, which can be really frustrating. Wouldn't it be nice to get a little bit more info before just blindly swapping out parts? In the 64 Commodore introduction video, I mentioned that I'd occasionally take a more in-depth look at machines that were featured in the series. This is one of those videos. In this case, this Amiga 500 I plan to feature in a future episode, however I need to get it restored and returned to its owner right away. It's given me the dreaded green screen of death, which actually means a RAM issue. But that could be any of these RAM chips, the bus drivers, the Agnes chip or its socket, or even just a damaged trace on the board. So in this quick little Tidbit Tuesday, we're going to take a look at Chuck Hertel's DiagROM for Amigas. It's a handy little replacement for the standard Kickstart ROMs that can give you diagnostic information even if you have no video output whatsoever. So we started by replacing the standard Kickstart ROM in the machine with the DiagROM. Now this Amiga 500 is a Rev 6A board. If you have an unmodified version 5 board, you will need a little adapter card. However, if you're using a version 5 board that's had the 1 meg Agnes upgrade done, then you won't need the adapter. So I started by installing DiagROM in this machine, hoping to get some useful data, but instead I'm just getting a similar screen flashing green and red instead of just being green. After a minute or two, it switches to these weird color bars. Now, this doesn't seem helpful, but it actually means something very useful to know. DiagROM is not finding any usable RAM whatsoever, so the only thing it has to work with for storing data is the 8 registers in the Motorola 68000 processor itself. But this is where one of the coolest features of DiagROM comes in. Even if the video output is completely dead, or like in this case, there's no RAM at all to use, so there's nothing for the video subsystems to display things like text, we can still get diagnostic data out of the machine by using a USB to serial cable and a simple telnet program like PuTTY. So first you'll need a serial to USB cable, which I'm going to link in the description below. Now for the cable I got, you also need a 9-pin male to 25-pin female serial adapter. Finally, you're going to need a 9-pin female to 9-pin female Null Modem adapter. Of course, a 9-pin female to 25-pin female Null Modem cable will work without any adapters, but I didn't have one of those. So, in order to set this up, first we plug the USB end of the cable into the PC. Next, we'll open the device manager, and under ports, we'll make a note of which COM port it's using. We also need to download and install PuTTY. Now in PuTTY, set the serial connection settings to 9600 BPS, 8 bits, no parity, and 1 stop bit, so 8N1. On the serial settings page, you also need to change the COM port to the one you found earlier. In this case, I'm using COM4. Now for all the Mac users out there, I am not ignoring you on purpose. I honestly have no idea how you would do this on a Mac. So if you do, please put a note in the comments below. Honestly, the newest Macintosh I own is a classic SE30. Next, plug the serial end into the serial port on your Amiga 500. If your cable has the wrong gender, use a gender changer, but make sure you're using the serial port. The parallel port is the same size, it just has the opposite gender as the serial port. As always, you also need to make sure that your Amiga is turned off. I know I harp on this a lot, but back in the day, 80% of my repairs was from people plugging stuff into their computers while the power was on. So we turn on the Amiga, and if everything's set up right, we should start seeing diagnostic data right on the PC screen. There you go, we got it, it's working. Oh, this is so cool. Now, if you're trying to do this and it's not working, check links in the description for additional information. Now with this all set up, you can get actual information on where your problems are instead of just guessing which chips to replace. This is super useful when dealing with a dead or glitchy Amiga. Now once the RAM issue is fixed, DiagROM is going to unlock a whole ton of other useful features. But before diving into that, let's break down what we're actually seeing here. So each line of data represents 4 bytes in the form of a 32-bit word. However, since the Amiga 500 I'm working on is a 16-bit machine, we actually have 2 16-bit words, each displayed on one line. So the second half of each line is really a separate 16-bit result. Now on a 32-bit Amiga, like this Amiga 3000, you won't have that happen because it needs all 32 bits for a single word. Also, on 32-bit Amigas like the Amiga 3000 here, you're going to need a different set of diagrams because they use 2 kickstart ROMs, a low ROM and a high ROM. Now, looking at the results here, one thing immediately stands out to me, and that is while not each line is the same, the errors always occur in the same 4 positions. Now, of course, you want to remember that the second half of each line is a separate result, so the errors we're seeing in the middle are really the exact same positions in memory as the errors that we're seeing at the beginning of the line. Now, what this is telling us is that the error is occurring in the first 4 bits of every memory address. And since nearly every line has an error, that explains why DiagROM can't find any usable RAM at all. So, checking the schematic for the Rev 6A motherboard, we can see that the system RAM is arranged into 4 4-bit chips, and the one responsible for those most significant 4 bits that are giving us the errors is U19. Given how the RAM is configured and that a single chip is responsible for all the errors we're seeing, it's really likely that U19 is indeed our culprit, but we'll need to change it and find out. I pulled the chip and installed a socket, and then I realized I don't have any RAM of this type on hand. Oh, luckily this machine's owner had left another machine with me that had already been picked over for parts, and so I pulled a RAM chip off of that, and it was bad. And then I pulled another RAM chip off of it, and that one worked. So let's fire her up and see where we're at. This is where DiagROM has really proved its worth. So instead of randomly swapping chips to try to figure out which one is wrong, it led us straight to the problem child, even though the computer had no video output whatsoever. This is a win for me. As you can see, it runs through a long series of tests before it eventually stops sending output to the serial port because everything appears to be working. Appearances can be deceiving, but we're definitely making progress. Now it's time to hook up to the monitor and see if we got any good output. One quick word of warning, on the next part there's a bunch of flashing on the screen, so if you're sensitive to that, you probably want to skip ahead about a minute. Okay, look at that. We've got good output. Awesome. After the initial test pass, we're presented with a menu, so let's take a look and see what they can do. Also, I do want to mention that I'm using the RGB to HDMI from my Amiga 500. The sparkling you're going to see in the text is an artifact of the capture, and on the CRT that I'm looking at, I didn't see that at all. Also, some of the video tests don't play well with the RGB to HDMI, so I may have to skip those or run them later once the original Denise is returned to the machine. So first up, let's do a RAM test. This machine has no additional RAM installed, so it just has to test the original 512K of chip RAM that's installed on the motherboard. And everything looks perfect. Next, we'll test the audio output. DiagROM has some basic tone outputs that you can use to test, and then it's got a little tune you can listen to. All right, everything sounds great. Now there's also some interrupt and CIA tests, which all ran fine. But when I moved on to the parallel port test, which is also using the CIAs, we find some errors. Also, to test the serial and parallel ports, you need to use a loopback adapter. Otherwise, you're just going to get errors. DiagROM includes instructions on how to build the loopbacks. You can do that yourself, or you can do like I did, and I'm using this one from Retro Rewind. The serial port checked out fine, but when I got to looking at the errors on the parallel port, I kept mucking around messing with the odd CIA because that's right by the parallel port. Now, when I was replacing those and I was thinking there's something wrong with the board because I still had the error, I dug out the schematics and it became clearly apparent right away that the 3 lines that I'm having trouble with actually come from the even CIA by the floppy drive. I swapped out that chip and everything was golden. So everything was looking good, so the next thing I did was clean and lube the floppy drive. And I've shown this in videos before, so I'll put a link in the description if you want to go check that out. So next I gave the case and the keyboard a good cleaning and they came out looking wonderful. So it was time to reinstall the motherboard in the case and put the original Kickstart ROM back in the machine. Now it's time to fire it up and give it a test. Sweet, we got a proper Kickstart screen. So next I'm going to boot up Amiga Test Kit for some additional checks. I did a quick memory test just to be thorough, but it passed just like the DiagROM one did. Next, I tested the keyboard. The keyboard test in the DiagROM is good enough to kind of see if each key you press does something, but the Amiga Test Kit one is beautiful with the graphic of the keyboard, and you can just drag your hand across the keys and all the ones that get hit get lit up green. It's looking perfect. Now, I have never had problems with the graphics tests in Amiga Test Kit with the RGB to HDMI, so I used those tests and everything looks wonderful. All right, time for the real test. Let's play some Turrican. Badly, of course, because that's the only way I know how to play Turrican.
Welcome to Turrican.
I'm looking at composite video on the 1702 on my bench, which is hooked up to an A520 RF modulator, so I get good video output with no lag. But what you're seeing was captured using the RGB to HDMI's HDMI output going into an inexpensive HDMI video capture device. So now with the machine appearing to be working perfectly, there's just one more thing to check. I'll remove my RGB to HDMI and my Denise out of the machine and put the Denise that came with the machine in, make sure that's working. And a final run of Amiga Test Kit showed that everything's working great. All right. So yeah, DiagROM. This is the first time I've done serial capture through DiagROM. That's not a tool I had back in the day, and honestly, back in the day, 99% of the time, I was replacing CIAs because people were plugging stuff in with the power on, as I mentioned earlier. I wouldn't hesitate to pick this stuff up because, again, it's very inexpensive. I hope this helped you out. If you have any tips, feel free to leave them in the comments. Check out this video where I checked out this machine along with 63 other Commodores that need restoration in 64 Commodore. Thanks for coming!